Good morning. It is an honor to be here. So I thank the organizers of this festival and also my friend, Patricio, Arriagada, sitting there. We've been trying to organize a visit for some time now. The pandemic intervened. And the only complaint I have is that this lecture has very strong competition from the day outside. And if I had a choice, I'd be outside. So thank you very much for helping me fight this competition. I want to talk about climate change as a historian and talk about it as a kind of historical event, but also share with you my realization that while historians like myself were writing and thinking about the history of the war after the Second World War, in certain ways, scientists, particularly geologists and people whom later on we would call Earth system scientists, but that name came much later in the story, they were also telling us about history, about deep history, but deep history that was becoming contemporary history. And I'll begin with these two kinds of histories. So if you think about the phenomenon of decolonization from European empires, there have been two moments of decolonization. So the 19th century is when a lot of Latin American countries became formally independent of European empires. So there was a kind of, we did not call it decolonization then, but there was a kind of end of European empires in this part of the world in the 19th century. But then European imperialism gradually ended again in the 20th century. From the 1950s to the 60s, end of Vietnam Wars, 1975, and I think of the end of apartheid in South Africa as the end of, at least formally, the end of white supremacy. Of course, there's white supremacism in other forms. We talk about neo-imperialism, we talk about neo-colonialism. But if you think about the world from 1945 on, then you might think, if you think only about human beings, that we were becoming more democratic in our consciousness, in our thinking. So the United Nations famous human rights resolution that's passed after the war, indigenous peoples resolution. Then if you think about the 50s, one of the most important development in the 50s and the 60s throughout the world is the creation of new universities. Every country you go, you find new universities. In England, they're called red brick universities that were set up in the 50s and 60s partly because of there was need for skilled people. There was an awareness. So a lot of people from families that did not go to universities began to go to the universities. And that had an impact on history writing. So in England, the interest in the writing histories of common people, working class people, really begins in the 1950s, late 1950s. And so what I did for my PhD in labor history, which was also popular in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, it all goes back to the 1960s. Then if you think of the civil liberties movement in America, the civil rights movement, then think of indigenous peoples' movements. The Australian Aboriginals were for the first time counted in national census in the mid-1960s, 65 or 66 was the first time they were actually counted. Before that, it was like the Indian caste system. There is a very well-known Indian anthropologist in Delhi called Andre Bete, who studied a village in Tamil Nadu, in Madras, in the 1960s. And he found that if he asked the Brahmins of the village how many people lived there, he got one figure. And if you ask the so-called untouchable people or ex-untouchable people, how many people lived there, he got a larger figure. Because the Brahmins didn't include the untouchables in their mental imagination of the number of people who lived in that village. Australia was like that. So their censuses didn't include Aboriginal people. Now they began to, from the mid-60s onwards. So if you think about this, just as a historian, I can tell you that post-Second World War, there has been a democratization, at least the spirit of history writing was that of democratization. Feminism, the second wave feminism of the 1970s says, we haven't been talked about. So there are a lot of new histories of women, a lot of new histories of indigenous people, a lot of new histories of marginal people, leading to very interesting debates between memories and histories. There were debates in Australia about Aboriginal people having certain dances which were to do with the past. And we historians were debating, is that history? Will you call it history? So in many ways, the discipline was exploding, new things were happening, but we thought human histories were becoming better in the sense that it was not like racism was gone. It was not like the caste was gone in India. It was not like class was gone, but at least people were critical of them, and more critical of them, of gender discrimination, of caste discrimination, of race discrimination. So in that sense, it looked like we were getting better spiritually. Even materially, we were getting better. And there's a Harvard psychologist, very well known, called Steve Pinker, who has been writing about this for a long time, saying how human history was continuously improving. You know, when Kant wrote his book called Conflict of Faculties, it had a chapter where Kant asks, is the human species capable of continuous development and progress? And he, of course, makes it conditional. He sets out 4 conditions. He says, if these conditions are fulfilled, they may, and one of them, interestingly, was if they're given enough time, and we'll come back to that question, if we have enough time to be better and progressive. But if you read Steve Pinker, you'd see that there is a kind of faith in progress in a contemporary thinker who gives a lot of data to show that human history is, his claim was that overall violence was decreasing. Overall number of people getting killed. And, you know, in certain parts of the world, myself included, I was born in India. I left India when I was 27. And then since then, I've lived in Australia and in the United States. I have not seen a major war in my life. But personally, it has not affected me. We have had small fights with China and Pakistan, but not really. So when my father used to tell me about his time in India, banks used to fail all the time. People used to put money in a bank and then live fearfully that the bank would crash. Now, you don't hear about that. Governments underwrite banks. All kinds of things have happened. So you might think that human history is actually overall getting better. Steve Pinker would argue that. But now, when the climate crisis happened, and I came to it late, I began to work on climate change quite late, around 2008-9. I was, I may say, at least in the English language, one of the first humanists and humanities persons to take interest in climate change. So I wrote an article. My first article got translated into many languages, including Spanish and Portuguese. But really, by the time I began to read, and I realized that scientists were talking about the same period, 1945 on, but in a very different way, giving us a very different history, which is the history of global warming. And I want to share that history with you. So this goes back to a period before Second World War, when both the Soviet Union and the Americans were getting interested in cybernetics and systems theory on both sides. And also during the war, they began to think about the atmosphere as something to be weaponized. So the question was, can you cause droughts or floods in your enemy's territory? So just as there was biological warfare, there was the thought of climate warfare, using weather as a weapon. And then there were, of course, the nuclear bomb. The atom bomb, they exploded, and then the development of a nuclear bomb. The first atom, the first fission happened on my campus. So both because of this weaponizing of space, of atmosphere, measuring the fallout of the nuclear explosions, and because of a growing interest in space. So the Soviets sent the Sputnik in 1958. The first Sputnik was 1958. The growing interest in space. These three things made the atmosphere of political interest to both the Soviets and the American establishment. So the United States president used to receive a report every year from scientists on the state of the world's atmosphere. And that's why money began to flow in atmospheric research. And it was in 1958 that an American scientist called Roger Revelle told the president, but he also said this in an article that he published. He was a geophysicist. He used to be at the University of Chicago, then went to Michigan and other places. When he first said, and I'm trying to quote it verbatim from memory though, he said, mankind has been conducting an experiment by putting out into the atmosphere very quickly the gases or the fossil fuel, or the gases from fossil fuel, but when it has taken the planet hundreds of millions of years to produce that fuel. And he said it's an experiment, we don't know the results of it. So if you think about it, there was built into it human time and the time of the planet. So even when we talk about renewable fuels and non-renewable fuels, we make a distinction that's based on human time. Actually, the so-called non-renewable fuels, fossil fuels, are renewable if you can wait for 200 or 300 million years. So it's in terms of human time that they're non-renewable. And this clash between human time and the time that the planet takes to do something is completely part of this story. So eventually, there was a question of space competition because the Soviets put up Sputnik. Hannah Arendt completed her book on the human condition talking about the Sputnik. And NASA started a wing, a research division under Carl Sagan, the famous scientist, to see if the Americans would be able to colonize Mars, settle human beings on Mars, both as part of civilization, but also as part of military strategy. And I remember growing up in Calcutta and an old Time magazine cover that gave an artist's imagination of what Mars might look like when humans settled it. Now, can you imagine what Mars would have looked like to an American artist in his imagination? Mars looked like Manhattan. All skyscrapers. So this moment, a British scientist called James Lovelock, who was a very good instrument maker and a chemist, he was hired by NASA, or he joined NASA, Carl Sagan's unit, for 6 years, from 1960 to 66, I think, 5 or 6 years. Worked on this team, and their question was, could Mars be made inhabitable for human beings? This inhabitable is a very interesting word. It'll play an interesting role in the story I'm telling. And so think about the situation. These are scientists, physicists, chemists, didn't have a biologist on the team. Later on, Lynn Margulis, who was a kind of biologist, Carl Sagan's wife, joined them. But these are scientists thinking about what life was, not what individual life was. How does a planet come to be friendly to life, to complex life? In planetary science, it's called the habitability problem. How does a planet make it possible for life to inhabit it? And it's funny what they were reading. One of the books they were reading was a book by the physicist Schrödinger called What is Life? which was basically a physicist's understanding of life based on thermodynamics. These were lectures he gave in Dublin in 1939. And you can still find it in libraries. It's called What is Life? They were reading that book. So it's a bunch of scientists who are not biologists were trying to figure out what life is. Now, in biology, life is not a definable problem. People would say, life begins when chemistry turns into biology. Life and death are very difficult to define in biological sciences. But it was at that point that they began to ask the question, how did life come to be on this planet? So the question is, moment you asked this particular problem, how do you colonize Mars, how do you make Mars inhabitable, it becomes a comparative planetary studies. Because the only planet it's a sample size of one. The only planet we know where there has been life, multicellular life continuously for billions of years, and multicellular life, like our kind of life, for at least 500 million years, in spite of 5 extinctions. This is the planet we know. So they began to look at this planet to understand what it might require to make Mars inhabitable. And they quickly worked out that even though humans think that they're in charge of this planet, they're central to this planet, our planet, the blue planet is our home, they quickly realized that humans don't play all that important a role in ensuring that humans can live on this planet. And the very, very interesting example of that in the history that these scientists were telling, I read them as historians. Their methods are different, archives are different, but they're telling a story. So I read it as history, but not my kind of history, but a bigger history. And so they were saying, take this atmosphere. This atmosphere has 21% oxygen. If there was more oxygen, everything would be inflammable, go up in flames. If there was less oxygen, we would all choke to death. And the problem with oxygen is that oxygen is what in chemistry they call a reactive gas. It doesn't stay alone. It's very promiscuous. It oxidizes something else. So it combines with other things to become this oxide, carbon dioxide, that kind of stuff, right? So you have to supply the air constantly with oxygen for oxygen to be maintained at this level. Yesterday, Rashid Sumaili in his talk was saying the 50% of this fresh oxygen is produced by the sea. Algae, fungi, phytoplanktons. And then these scientists realized that the reason why there was oxygen, this atmosphere was once, had very little oxygen. It was mostly nitrogen. And early bacteria were nitrogen-eating bacteria, or that's called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And there is an event in the history of this planet which happened 2.5 billion years ago when suddenly there was a release of oxygen into the atmosphere. It's called the Great Oxidation Event. And it was because of bacteria and algae and forms of life that we call inferior forms of life. So even today, the level of oxygen for the last 500 million have not always been 21%. It's fluctuated. But it's fluctuated within a band that has ensured that life existed. So think of it. If global warming goes on, and we end up with the sea temperature going up by, let's say, 6 degrees Celsius, and this hasn't happened, I'm talking about actually model, then the phytoplanktons will die. If the phytoplanktons die, we shut off about 50% of the oxygen we need. So think of it. We depend on this oxygen. Without this oxygen, there's no breathing. But we don't do anything to supply the air with this oxygen. Other smaller creatures do it. And I was amazed to read for how long other forms of life have been doing this. Almost close to 400 million years. So these scientists call it our modern atmosphere, but the word our doesn't make any sense. Right? So this is a kind of history that My friend Ashil Membe from South Africa, he's from Senegal, he has a beautiful expression where he says, this is a history we belong to, but it's not our history in any particular sense. Because this oxygen is also used by other animals, it's used by trees, it's used by plants, it's used by many forms of life. And they play a role in producing this oxygen, this microbial life. So the microbial life are actually far more important than our form of life in maintaining this life. And that's why in one of their meetings in NASA, Lovelock said, make Mars inhabitable by bacteria and leave it to them. They'll do the job. So he was basically saying bacteria are far more important than we are in the story of life. So when I read these people, I realized that I'm reading another kind of history. When I write the history of empire, gender distinction, race distinction, colonization, indigenous people, the possibility of socialism or the possibility of non-capitalist development, end to extractivist capitalism, that is a history of which the hero is the human being. Human beings, it's a human-centered story. So human beings are central to the story of the last 500 years of European expansion and the making of the world that we call modern. So, my modern is maximum 500 years old, as my historian, or even if you read Chris Bailey's book, The Making of the Modern World, 1815 to 1914, he says is modern. And then I read this geologist and they say modern, 375 million years. So the name modern kind of, boom, changes. And I don't know why it's modern. It's modern because the atmosphere used to be different before then. And it's not modern with reference to humans. So even if we didn't exist, this atmosphere would remain because other forms of life will do their job. So this is a history without which you can't explain human existence, human evolution, but it's not our history. So whether you read geology or whether you read evolutionary biology, history of life, humans just come too late in the story to be at the center of the story. So this history is something where humans get decentered. So the first realization I came to, and thanks to a lot of help from a French philosopher, actually, Catherine Malabou, who both in conversation and writing said to me, Dipesh, we say global warming and we say globalization. But the word globe means two different things. The globe of globalization is not the same as the globe of global warming. So eventually I came to realize that the globe of global warming is more like what these scientists who were asking this question, how does life is sustained on this planet, they eventually created this concept of Earth system. That is, this entire planet actually works as a system. This is the application of, remember I said they were getting interested in systems theory in the 1930s and 40s. So this was an application of systems theory in a multidisciplinary science. NASA created the first subcommittee actually, on Earth system science in 1983. And then as soon as the subcommittee was formed, we had one crisis, which is the beginning of the public awareness, but we did not know it as that. Some of you will remember, there was an ozone hole discovered above the southern hemisphere. So I was in Australia, you were here, you were all affected by it. Australia immediately created a huge publicity campaign on television on rubbing sunscreen before you went to the beach. That was the first hint that humans were capable of creating damage at a planetary level. That what we were putting in refrigeration technology or in the propellant cans, the propellant liquid, could actually eventually damage the atmosphere. So these guys also realized that life is made sustainable on this planet, not only by the oxygen, but also by the fact that there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These methane, carbon dioxide, they're called trace gases. Trace gases meaning they are a very small percentage of the atmosphere. So people talk about how much CO2 is up there. They say 400 parts per million, 450 parts per million. So per million, it's so much, if the million is the volume. Before Industrial Revolution, it was 280. That's what they said we should get back to. So we need greenhouse gases. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, this would be like Mars, a very cold planet, because they retain heat. But if you put too much of it up there, then they build up the heat. And that affects all kinds of problems. But one of the things it does is that it basically, all that carbon accumulating, eventually it comes back with rain and eventually goes into the seas. And the first thing it happens, it sort of changes the acidity of the sea water. When the seawater becomes more acidic, then little creatures which have to make shells, like oysters and things, right? They can't make shells, the shells dissolve. It's too acidic. And when these small creatures die, then the big creatures that eat the small creatures begin to die. So you affect the food chain. And therefore, another problem is extinction eventually. And food security for other creatures and then extinction. So, as the scientists were thinking all this, there was a very well-known historian, John McNeill, who joined these Earth system scientists. And John McNeill, as a historian, said, if you look at the same statistics that Steve Pinker was looking at, and saying humans are living so well, the statistics are not untrue. But they show you that human happiness and human well-being has suddenly, and human numbers most importantly, has suddenly grown exponentially. So if we were, say Homo sapiens are now considered our kind of species, our species, we are now considered to be 300,000 years old. Nothing compared to the 375 million year story I told you, right? And then it took us almost up to 1900 to reach the figure of 1 billion. So that is a fascinating history. Quite early on in our history, chimps are supposed to be our closest relatives. If you look at the big apes, they don't have 3-generation families. They have 2-generation families because of the longevity. Humans actually, even in indigenous societies, had 3-generation families. So quite early on, we could live longer. But it still took us up to 1900. So in 1900, we were 1.6 billion. At the end of the century, 2000, we are 6 billion. Now we are 8, going on to 9 or 10. So when you look at our history, it just suddenly goes up. It is exponential, it's very quick. So that's why they call it the great acceleration graphs, these people. So I'll begin with showing you some of these graphs. So Will Steffen is an Earth system scientist, and John McNeill is one of the authors of this paper, but I think he gave these scientists a sense of our kind of history, my kind of history. And so I don't know if you can look at this. So this is the pointer working? Perhaps not. But if you look at the vertical line on every graph, that is 1950. And you can see how it all goes up very, very steeply. For urban population, real GDP, FDI, fertilizer consumption, primary energy use, large dams, water use, right? Actually, if you resolve these graphs even more finely, you will find that the first spurt for growth comes from European reconstruction after the war. Then it's the new nations. Like most of India's electricity during colonial rule actually did not come from fossil fuels. A lot of it was hydro. Bombay was run on hydro electricity, not fossil fuels. India's use of fossil fuel expands after independence because they want to industrialize, they build dams, irrigation becomes very important, so need more power. So next would be these new countries, China, India, and then once China opens up, Deng Xiaoping's period, so after Mao's death, the 1978-79, when they have the 4 modernization drives. So from the 1980s on, Just as you have American deindustrialization, sending industries overseas to Mexico and other places, and China is becoming a world leader, it just shoots up. Remember yesterday, Rashid was saying that 90% of the world fishing farms are now in Asia. 70% of the world's consumers, middle-class consumers, are now of Asia, Africa, Latin America. They're not any longer, even 20 years ago, 70% of the world consumers came from the OECD countries. So that's just breaking up. That's what I was telling you. Again, it's not visible so clearly. But these were the most interesting graphs. Also, the vertical line is, dotted line is 1950. And it showed that just as human life was expanding, numbers were expanding. And you have to remember, in human numbers expanding, just to go back quickly, human population. Again, I have to mention, so first of all, public health systems were improving from mid-19th century. But a key story in all this is the discovery of penicillin, pasteurization, and then of antibiotics. Antibiotics actually saved a lot of lives during the Second World War. But it's also true that today, the amount of penicillin that you need to cure an infection is 4 or 5 times the amount of penicillin you needed when penicillin was invented. So the whole story of antibiotic-resistant bacteria is a fascinating story of evolution. But so human life expectancy expanded. My grandfather had 15 kids. 7 of them died. My parents had 2. Because by the time I was born, their antibiotic was there and they had the assurance that their children would sort of, not predecease them. Which was true. I mean, I had diphtheria when I was 17. If I had been born before antibiotics, that would have been the end of my life. Right? So we have benefited from all these things. And mind you, this was all made possible because of access to cheap and plentiful energy that came from fossil fuels. It also meant you could transport medicine. And fossil fuels are actually used in production of medicines, but actually the fact is you could transport medicine. And this process of the expansion of the human realm goes up, it's sort of ratcheted up. Flying becomes a mass industry in 1960s with the invention of the jet engine. Before that, it was expensive to fly. So today, 2007, is when first time when more than half of humanity began to live in cities. And today that's expanding. They say humanity will become, by the end of this century, a city-dwelling species. And the more you live in cities, in fact, the prediction is that by the end of this century, some cities will have 90 million people. We call 20 million people cities crowded. And if you have the same kind of city building that we now have now, one effect of living in cities is that, given our technology, you forget the connection between seasons and the production of food. Just to give an example, when I grew up in India, I always knew mango to be a summer fruit. Now in Chicago, I eat mangoes through the year, thanks to refrigeration technology, cold storage. Refrigeration is a major, major problem for climate change. But without refrigeration, you wouldn't have the food industry. We were talking about this yesterday. Without refrigeration, you wouldn't have it. But the more that happens, you forget the connection between seasons and your life. When the British came to India, the first roads they built were called all-weather roads. So that's like forget. Before that, when we fought wars, you had to wait for the season to be friendly to war making. Sometimes the river was not fordable in monsoon. So warring parties had to wait. We developed technology which means we can fly in bad weather, we can fight in bad weather. So we've tried to make our life increasingly independent of what the planet does, right? Push it in the background. But the interesting thing was that this is what they discovered, that from 1950 on, the planet was responding to what we were doing. So it was all the first three, nitrous oxide, methane, carbon dioxide, are greenhouse gases. So they all go up from the mid-1950s, as well as there are other. The tropical forest loss is a very important figure. The pandemic is tied to loss of forests. And many infectious disease specialists, including Anthony Fauci in America, actually Fauci and one of his colleagues, David Morans, wrote a paper in 2020 in a journal called Bio, where they were arguing, and this have been arguing for a while, that we have actually entered an era of pandemics. Because by destroying forests, we are forcing wildlife to come close to us in different ways. Wildlife don't seek out human beings. I mean, they know how bad we are. But when you fragment their habitat, they are forced to come close to us, and then you have viruses and bacteria, jumping species. And that's exactly, so actually there was prediction around at least 12 years ago, infectious disease, people were saying that we were waiting for a pandemic. And the bird flu was a narrow miss, luckily for us. But if you look at why the pandemic becomes a pandemic, is because so many of us are flying around. We live in cities. And it's easy to, there have been infectious diseases at least since the time that humans have domesticated animals. Which is why they say that, the kind of bacteria a dog carries, accidentally a dog could kill you, but it's very unlikely that the dog would actually give us a virus that will become a pandemic. But on the other hand, if you think of the coronavirus and what it is doing, it's evolving in front of us. Right? And we have now become a civilization where you have to sustain these people, so you have to think, okay, let's think new vaccinations. Maybe we'll have to take this vaccine in America, so maybe we'll have to take this alongside the flu vaccine, I'll have to take my corona vaccine every year, right? So so what has happened? This is where the Steve Pinker story turns, or even Foucault's biopolitics story turns. In other words, in wanting to live better than before, we had a time when we lived much better than before, there's no question. But we lived so much better than before that we imperiled ourselves. The pandemic is probably the clearest instance. And, I go from one country to another, I talk about Indian friends, and Indian friends actually said something very clear. They said, look, the lesson is clear. The moment humans were forced to withdraw, the skies were less polluted, the rivers were less polluted, birds people had not seen came back to the cities. Animals, sometimes unwelcome animal, came to the cities, right? If you look at the animal world, throughout the world, a lot of wild animals are trying to become urban animals because cities are expanding into their habitat. I mean, the clear story is in Mumbai. Mumbai is expanding into leopard territory. So the leopards are forced to become urban animals. And initially, they try to come into cities and eat our street dogs. But then they realize that the street dogs live in gangs. And if they try to eat one street dog, the others howl so much that people are alerted. Then humans come chasing the leopard. So the leopards worked out that the best meat or the best food are domestic pet dogs. So there's a wonderful not wonderful, fascinating video on YouTube. You'll see a Mumbai leopard waiting in front of an automatic glass door in a multi-story building because it spotted a domestic dog inside. And when the door opens, it just goes and grabs the domestic dog and runs away. But that's because the leopard is trying to learn how to live in Mumbai. It never lived in Mumbai before. So that's what's happening. Now, but this story is the story that the Earth, the planet, is not an inert background. So if industrial civilization and post-industrial civilization was about forgetting the planet, forget the seasons. So, yesterday we were talking about how much fish we produce. The animal lives we have affected, so we have many more number of cattle now than there would have been naturally. Because the more people become middle class, they want to eat more protein everywhere. So the most populous bird on the planet, do you know which one is the most popular bird on the planet? Any guesses? It's broiler chicken. 21 billion of them. The next most popular bird is naturally populous. It's 1.5 billion. So we make 21 billion chickens because we need the protein. Similarly, we are forcing the sea to produce more salmon than the sea would have naturally produced because we need the protein. But underneath the salmon farms in Tasmania, the sea is a dead zone. We need lithium batteries. Some of the elements, minerals that the lithium batteries need are actually mined from undersea islands. So there are islands undersea, when sea level has gone up. These would have been islands before. And these islands are biodiversity hotspots. So when you actually take minerals from there, you destroy biodiversity. So there's a new book by two geologists, British geologists, Jan Zalasiewicz and Mark Williams, who are both professors at Leicester. And it's about the history of the Indian human biosphere. And it's called Oasis, a cosmic oasis. And they actually say that if you have anybody tell you that solar panels and lithium batteries are not harmful for the environment, don't believe them. But these may be the lesser of the evils that we are facing. So basically out of that, what I want to say is that Patricio, 5 minutes? Good, thank you. So out of that, I developed a distinction between, in my book, which I will not, maybe in conversations, in Q&A if you need, we can go into the other slides. Go back to Catherine Malabou's point that when we write global history, humans are the heroes. But there is a history of the Earth system. And I'll say one thing about the Earth system and then conclude this talk. So, for instance, however much carbon dioxide you put out there, eventually the Earth has a cycle called the carbon cycle which will remove it all. So if you just kept adding carbon dioxide, there might be an extinction, there might be overheating of the planet, we might go extinct, but eventually, in 100,000 years, this will go. So when we say there is excess carbon dioxide, what do we mean? We mean that the planetary processes by which they absorb carbon dioxide do not work fast enough for our purposes. So that is why there is talk about technology, climate engineering, geoengineering, carbon sequestering, all of these things. People are working on these things. In other words, it's like getting on a horse and saying, giddy up, giddy up. So we are kind of riding this planet saying, giddy up, giddy up. And the other thing you have to remember, this is a beautiful point that Carl Schmitt made. He made this point that when you have technology on land, then your life doesn't depend on that technology. You have other things you can do if you don't have technology. But when you are actually in a ship, a steamship, or even a sailing ship in the deep seas, if the ship fails as a technological system, you're doomed. There's a geologist at Duke University who says that without technology, modern technology, you can't sustain 8 billion, 10 billion people. And he says if you take technology out, human population will crash to 11 million. So technology has become the precondition for biology. So it's not easy to give it up. So let me then finish by talking about a certain problem. Problem is this. The United Nations set up IPCC in 1988, following the ozone hole crisis and following the way the ozone hole crisis was solved by all nations coming together, and it was known then as the Montreal Protocol. So IPCC created Kyoto Protocol, and here is the problem we now face. The IPCC's, all their calendars for action come out of Earth system science, and they think of this planet as one, Earth system. So they're asking us to respond as one, as human species. But our unity as a species is pre-political. Politically, we're always divided. Within nations, within groups, that's what humans have been. Humans have always been divided. So we are never one politically. So on the other hand, we are feeling the need for planetary governance, right? So people say, should WHO have more power? And I'll end by just suggesting one or two things that where we can, with existing institutions, do better. We can, for instance, ask UNESCO to nominate as humanities heritage climate systems, natural spots on which a lot of people depend. So the Amazon forest, for instance, the North Atlantic current that takes warm water to the north, the Siberian permafrost, the deep oceans that play a role in the climate system. The Himalayan mountain ranges have 8 or 9 rivers servicing countries from Pakistan to Vietnam. There's no agreement among these countries. So there could be a regional authority because the Himalayas have become the most militarized mountain range in the world because of India and China. So there is a lot to be done. But when people talk about climate emergency, there's a question of time. So I come back to this human time question, right? The UN was formed on the assumption that we had plenty of time. If you ask when would Israelis and Palestinians live in peace, you'd say, don't know. If you ask when will capitalism end, say, don't know. But the climate calendar is not like that. It requires a definite, finite time. So this assumption of infinite time at human disposal, which allows for us to be different from one another and bargain, and the oneness of the planet, this contradiction is now the critical political problem that we have to address through our politics. Okay. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dipesh, for this interesting and very thought-provoking talk. Considering the time we have and to leave some time for the audience to make some questions too, I would like to ask you about some ideas that you have shared with us in your recent book on the climate of history in a planetary age that it's been translated to Spanish. Hopefully we will have it next year. As you say in your book, we live in a special and crucial moment concerning, and I quote, our own awareness of ourselves. The now of human history has become entangled with the long now of geological and biological timescales, something that has never happened before in the history of humanity. As you said recently in your talk, we have become aware the background is no longer just a background. Yeah. So I would like to, if you can refer, quickly take some time to make a reflection about the impact in this post-pandemic scenario. Un poquito más. Un poquito más lejos ya. Ahí sí. Sí, ya. Gracias. Do you think this sense of awareness has changed in recent years? Yeah. How can we remain sensitive and empathic to planetary issues at a geological, biological level when on a technosphere level, as you just said, pushes continuously to increase our sense of domination over the nature?
No, I think the very fact that I've been invited to address this audience and that people are talking about climate on the media, the awareness has definitely increased. I mean, when I think back, an a very well-known historian called Charles Meyer from Harvard University wrote an essay in 2000 in American Historical Review, and it was called Consigning the 20th Century to History. So goodbye 20th century. So a summary of what happened in the 20th century. IPCC was set up in 1988, and this learned historian in that article had not a word to say about climate change. Compared to that time, today, not just historians, I think we are generally aware. The problem today is how do you convert this awareness into action? And into action towards planetary action, not just nation-state-based actions. So how do you work at the local level? How do you work at the regional level? How do you work at the global level to address planetary problems?
And that's how did this work with the idea of generational political agency. In your book, you talk about, well, you quote Carl Schmitt and Arendt. Do you know any initiatives that
Well, first of all, I
may
say
help
that
way?
I said something that does not think about the unborn is not political enough. Something that does not think about the next generation, action that does not think intergenerationally is not political. It is purely consumerist. If you have a policy that is only about the welfare of the people who are already on the planet, but not future people, then that is very short-term politics, if you want to call it so. If middle classes in India and China think only about the growth, and sometimes I speak to Indian middle class people, they say, we will buy our way through this crisis, become rich and buy our way. And frankly, if you look at the rich, like Elon Musk, they are into the politics of survival. I mean, they think they'll escape to another planet. Right? There was a time when I used to think that the politics of survival belonged to the poor. If you look at the world today, it's the rich who are practicing politics of survival. So Indian rich family tries to have a child in Canada, in Australia, or wherever they think it'll be safe to go. Bangladesh is full of that. Countries I know. So, and that won't work very well because, as Bruno Latour and others say, we can't just go to another planet and survive because we are so much. I mean, our sense of body weight is dependent on the gravity we have. Right? Our entire body is shaped by gravitational forces. So you can't easily transplant ourselves. So that's why Latour is saying, and I suppose I'm also saying, first of all, realize that we are part of this planet. Your body may be your body, but it took millions of years to design this body. So it is not just your body. We are connected to other forms of body like monkeys and rats, mammals. That's why you can test an experimental drug on an animal and then bring it to us. If the bodies were not shared, it wouldn't happen. So basically, humans have to withdraw. If human realm is, what does withdrawal mean? It means building new kinds of cities. It means leaving more biodiversity hotspots. So Edward Wilson said, we should return all the national parks of the world, there are 150 of them, about 147, to the ecology they had before human intervention. And then we'll create more biodiversity. But I'm just saying that the principle has to be withdrawal. We are a minority form of life. The microbes are the majority form of life. If everybody was human, we would look like the whites in South Africa, a minority form of life dominating the rest. So we need to learn to live like a minority form of life without losing our sense of concern for each other. So we have to be alive to justice issues, but at the same time build technology, build other things, and I could speak to this more, that are, whether you call it sustainable, but that contribute to the habitability of the world, right? Also allow other forms of life to live with us.
And do you have hope in that process to work? Because considering the relation between
this came up yesterday.
The democratization through consumption.
Right. There was also democracy. Yeah. So today the tension is between the rising aspirations of people for consumption, and consumption itself is democratic. I mean, if you go to India, you'll find how the availability of the smartphone, cheap Chinese smartphone, everybody has them and they're delighted to have them. The MRI machine, I mean, anybody with cancer goes and gets an MRI test. So, but the point is, how do you have these technologies in a way that the biosphere is not threatened? It's a very difficult task. In this book that Jalasowicz and Mark Williams have written, they give an example from Indian state of Meghalaya of the principle on which we'll have to build technologies. The principle is that you build technology that will biodegrade. So can an MRI machine biodegrade? Can a bridge biodegrade? So the example they give is of a bridge across a river in a hilly terrain in the Meghalaya, where basically what they've done is, traditional indigenous people, the tree roots are very long. So they kind of manage to guide the roots of a tree from this part of the riverine, to the other shore, and eventually build a bridge with the tree roots connecting the two sides. And they give an example of that to say that eventually we'll have to find technology that biodegrades. So can we combine our sense of well-being, our protection, with that kind of technology? This may mean that that this consumerist capitalism is unsustainable, and we have to find other ways.
Do you know any practices that are ongoing practices that you think that might mark in some way what we have to do?
Clearly, the poor communities have an advantage in this. Communities that have already invested in high-tech living, we have more to lose. So it's more difficult for people who have benefited from this growth. It's more difficult for them to give up on it.
Yeah,
sure. So, India had Gandhi, and Gandhi was saying in the 1930s that enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. And India went against Gandhi to follow the Soviets, industrialization, mass production of goods. So clearly, everybody thought this was the way to go. This is good for human beings. And I'm not blaming people, because human beings have derived a lot of benefit from the use of cheap energy. So the question is, how do we keep some of these benefits? How do we keep a sense of justice and then make a transition? And to go back to your point, I always say that I'm not an optimist, but I'm very hopeful. Because hope is existential. Without hope, you can't be a human being.
Yeah, sure. And have you noticed some changes from the perspective how sciences see humanities as a complement to address climate change crisis in recent years?
This is increasingly happening. First of all, Earth system science is a very abstract science, right? Even the Earth system is an abstraction. We have something to learn from them, and they have something to learn from us. So, for instance, the example they give from Meghalaya is from anthropologists' account, right? So they're actually reading, some of them are reading some of us. And even John McNeill, the Great Acceleration story, it needed a historian to put it in perspective and say, look, in 3,000 years, only 200 years, we've just gone boom with technology, right? This is exponential. So, yes, they came together in the Great Acceleration graphs. And I think increasingly, we see the development of what I call planetary humanities. Planetary humanities meaning combining the two perspectives. One is what I call the globe of globalization. So you remember imperialism, you remember capitalism, you remember gender inequality, you remember indigenous people, their loss of land, everything. But you also have this other perspective which decenters us, where you begin to realize that we are a minority species living like a dominant majority.
And at an undergraduate level or graduate level at the university?
Yeah, actually, my university...
Interdisciplinary groups or researchers that work
together?
In fact,
my university we made a recommendation to the university, in University of Chicago, that any student who comes to the University of Chicago must know something about the climate crisis before they get their BA degree or BSc degree. So we're trying to make it, design the curriculum in such a way that you cannot graduate without knowing something about the crisis. So, look, my hope eventually is that we are a species that can learn. And we are teaching. So future researchers, leaders will be different. And something as an educator, I can tell you, the more you go up research, PhD level, research becomes like siloed. So undergraduate is the best level of teaching where you can give a holistic view. So you can bring philosophy, you can bring science, you can bring geology, you can bring literature, films, all together, right, in the undergraduate level. But as you go high up, people get into their disciplines. And it's harder to change that immediately.
No, sure. And you have noticed any changes considering the political changes, for example, in the US?
Left, Obama just signed the climate bill. Obama signed the climate bill, so there's a huge amount of money that will come. One of the things that is growing everywhere is this whole lithium battery technology. So we will move, soon the cars will become electric. So the storage question the more you get into solar and wind, the storage question will become important. There's a huge amount of money coming into battery technology. But as I was saying, it's not perfect.
Yeah, sure.
It still creates problems. Both solar panels, and they're not without problems. So when these scientists gave the example of indigenous people, they're talking about a completely future world that we don't know how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who's very well known. And he has worked on indigenous people and what he called the multinaturalism of the Amerindian. So he says, look, if the West has one nature that science studies, and many cultures, multiculturalism, the Amerindian has multinaturalism, many natures. But he has a sentence which I find quite chilling. He says, it's only in a post-catastrophic world, when human capability, I'm quoting from memory, when human capabilities have been permanently diminished. So only in a post-catastrophic world, when human capabilities have been permanently diminished, will the knowledge of indigenous people become a resource and wisdom. Now that's a scary prospect, because a post-catastrophic world may not give you a second chance to become Homo sapiens, the wise humans. So we need to do things now. We can't wait for a catastrophe to happen. So, I mean, I respect De Castro, but when I read that sentence in his Cannibal Metaphysics, I think, or in the book that he wrote with his philosopher, partner, or wife, Deborah Danowski, called The End of the World, 2014. It was published in Portuguese. That sentence was chilling, but it sounded so true, because he said, look, in the world there are 700 million indigenous people. And how many Indians and Chinese middle-class people waiting to become rich? The population is 3.5 billion. So the pressure of this civilization and the aspirations connected to this civilization are very powerful pressures. So that's why he has this sentence which he says, in a post-apocalyptic world, indigenous knowledge will be wisdom. So, and I'm saying, you can't wait for a post-apocalyptic world, because the apocalypse may be so bad that you may not get a second chance to be wise again.
Sure. Thank you, Dipesh.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.